Okay, so we're going to begin this discussion and on the history of the Soviet Union, the history of the Russian Revolution, its impact on the 20th century, its impact on the outlook of socialism as it developed in the 20th century and, of course, today in the 21st century. We'll also examine the weaknesses of the Soviet Union and assess how those weaknesses came about, what were the objective factors, meaning the factors rooted in social reality. In other words, not simply the policies of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but the world that the Soviet Union and those revolutionaries found themselves in. And we want to be able to do this because as an organization that promotes the socialist reorganization of society, we are in constant combat with the ruling class and its ideas. The ruling class, you know, they have the police and the armies and the courts and the prisons, the instruments of organized violence and repression that are used against our communities or against the workers when they're on strike or against oppressed people when they want to be independent. They have organized violence on their side, but they also have, and this is not less important and perhaps equally or more important, an array of ideas and conceptions that are promoted day in and day out, what we would call bourgeois ideology, so that the masses of people are not simply suppressed, they are also confused. They are not simply repressed, but they are also in different degrees influenced by the ideas of the ruling class. And those ideas keep the masses of oppressed workers in check because the ruling class has them thinking the thoughts that the ruling class itself wants them to think. And those are thoughts that are anything but revolutionary. So when they examine the Soviet Union, the first socialist revolution, the conclusion that they now bring to young people or any people who are interested in socialism is the Soviet Union existed, it was an example of socialism and communism, its ultimate overthrow and destruction represents not simply the destruction of a state, of a government, but the destruction of the idea of communism. In other words, it's been tried and it failed. And with that argument, they say socialism in life, not in textbooks, not in theory, not in argument, but in life, measured itself against world capitalism and proved to be insufficient, unsatisfactory, or even worse. And so we have come, as the ruling class and its apologists say, to the end of history. Society evolved through different stages. First, there was primary communal life, and then there was economic and social orders based in antiquity on slavery, and then it evolved to the Middle Ages and feudalism, and then to capitalism, the so-called free market and the rise of the capitalist class. And then the Marxists had said, after capitalism came socialism. In other words, that there was a march of transitions and transformations through history. History was progressive. There was an optimism about history because it evolved from lower to higher stages. But the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ruling class tells us, is an example that that history has ended, meaning it changed before, it transitioned before, but the next stage, that which the Marxists prognosticated, the socialist phase, turned out to be nothing more than a fantasy. And so we have come to the end of history. It's just a matter of tinkering with the existing social order, not replacing it. And so the crowning achievement of humanity is the rule of billionaires and bankers and corporate titans. And so here we have it. That's their line. That's the basic line that the bourgeoisie promotes all the time in academia, in lower education, in the popular social magazines, videos. And so socialism becomes, in large measure, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, obscured. So very few people know what socialism is. And if they know something about it, they think bad things about it, because that's the way the ruling class has packaged the story. So when we study the Soviet Union, we, of course, want to have a different methodology than the ruling class, and we come to a different conclusion. Our basic conclusion is, for the party, that the Soviet Union represented the first experiment where the oppressed people, the working people, the farmers, the peasants, the poor, not only overthrew their oppressors, but held state power, retained state power, and tried to reorganize society on a different social basis, without the capitalists, without a capitalist class, without private property and the basic means of production. And that this will be looked back upon in history not as the end of communism, as the ruling class promotes, but the first experiment in socialism. And its great achievements, in addition to its weaknesses, will be seized upon by our party and by other revolutionaries around the world to make a more perfect socialism, a better expression of socialism. And the weaknesses of the Soviet Union, in addition to its great achievements, can be explained not by the inherent deficiencies of socialism, but based on the historical problems, the real problems that existed in the Soviet Union and for socialists in the climate of the world environment during the time that the Soviet Union was born and grew. I want people to take this one reading. It's a simple paragraph. It's a quote from Marx in the 18th Brumaire. It says, "Men make their own history." Of course, this is old language, 19th century, so we would say men and women make their own history, but not just as they please. They do not choose the circumstances for themselves, but have to work upon circumstances as they find them, have to fashion the material handed down by the past. The legacy of the dead generations weighs like an Alp upon the brains of the living. An important conception because we as Marxists use the materialist, the historical materialist, rather than the idealist method to understand historical transitions and transformations. If we had a revolution tomorrow in the United States, we would still be plagued by all the problems that exist today. The problems of racism, the problems of sexism, the problems of anti-gay bigotry, the problems of division between those who have $100,000 or $200,000 in the bank and those who have nothing. The divisions in society would not simply disappear because we had a socialist revolution. We would find ourselves having to build socialism not on the battlefield that we had desired, but on the conditions as they exist. And you can imagine that that would include many problems that would have to be overcome. When Marx and Engels, the founders of scientific socialism, imagined where the socialist revolution would take place, they thought it would take place in the countries where capitalism was most developed, where industry and science was most developed. They thought it would happen not in one country, but in a combination of countries. They thought perhaps Germany and France would be the places where socialism would come to power first. And that based on the advanced economies of Germany and France in the 19th century, the working class would reorganize society, take the wealth that was produced in society but hoarded by the capitalists, and use it to solve the social problems of Germany and France, and possibly UK. They thought socialism was the next step going beyond advanced capitalism. That's important for us to remember. The prognosis of Marx and Engels when they wrote the Communist Manifesto was that the socialist revolution would happen first in a country like the United States, a country where the means of production was highly developed, where the problem was not the problem of scarcity or extreme poverty, but wealth that had been skewed in its distribution and by an economic system that went into crisis not because it produced too little, but because it had produced too much. In other words, a society ravaged by the problem of surplus. Just like when we saw in the housing crisis in 2007, the one that triggered the Great Recession, people lost their homes after the biggest housing construction boom in U.S. history. More houses were built in 2002 to 2007 than any other 5-year period. And then people lost their homes. In other words, more homes were built than could be sold for a profit, and that triggered a housing crisis, and millions of families lost their homes. In other words, not because of the problem of scarcity, but the problem of surplus. Marx and Engels thought socialism rationalized the economic order of advanced societies, advanced industrial societies, so that it overcame the problem of crisis caused by overproduction. That was the prognosis of Marx and Engels. Socialism would happen first in the advanced industrial countries. But life took a funny turn, and the revolution didn't happen in Germany or France. The revolution happened in one of the poorest countries of the capitalist world, inside of Tsarist Russia. 90% of the population were peasants, not workers. They were scattered in the countryside. Most were illiterate. In other words, those who became the new ruling class, for the most part, could not read or write. The sector of society that was highly educated, the so-called intelligentsia in Russia, was for the most part hostile to the revolution. Not all of them, but for the most part hostile to the revolution. At the time that the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution took place, first in March, February 1917, the February Revolution, and then the October Revolution. After that, 14 imperialist armies invaded Russia. And the country was plunged into a civil war. So you had the Russian communists coming to power in one of the poorest countries, a country that had the gross economy that was 1/12 the size of the United States. Population, again, largely illiterate. And as we examine Soviet history, we will see that almost all of the decisions made by the Bolsheviks in 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, and 1921, the first years of the revolution, were not based on the theory of Bolshevism or the theory of Marx or even the strategic conceptions of Lenin, but they were based on emergency decrees, given the fact that they were invaded, starving, and their very existence was threatened. Not just the existence of the political power of the communists, but the existential conditions of people. Poverty was so vast by 1919, 2 years after the revolution, that cannibalism reappeared in the countryside. Something that Marx and Engels would never have considered, that a socialist revolution would take place where scarcity was so great, where the conditions, the basis, the economic basis for the construction of socialism was so scant, so removed. That was beyond the conception. And Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, all of the primary leaders of the Russian Revolution, dealt with that problem first and foremost. How could they survive as a socialist country, or a country that had the perspective of building socialism, when they were faced with 14 invading armies, poverty so great that cannibalism reemerged, and a population whose hunger became the dominant theme of the first years of the revolution? And the question is, for us and for them, was it smart under those circumstances? Was it correct, or was it a fantasy to have actually taken the power and taken the realm of government, the reins of government, and said, we are about to build socialism under these highly unfavorable circumstances. By the way, just to show and highlight how that problem manifested itself immediately, I'm going to come back to the question, was it wrong to have seized power given that problem? But just imagine, if you would, again, in this emergency mode, the exigencies of the day, what the Soviet Union, what the Russian revolutionaries were coping with. When the 14 imperialist armies invaded, including, by the way, the United States, all of those armies sided with those parts of the Russian population or the other populations who were hostile to the communists. They were either the old ruling classes, the educated, the intelligentsia, or backward people. In other words, amongst the workers and poor. Most of the workers and peasants were for the revolution, but there were, of course, sectors of the population that were opposed to it. When the Civil War started, the 14 armies invaded and hooked up with the counter-revolutionaries. The Russian Revolution had no army to fight. They created what was called the Red Army, and it was a volunteer force of workers and peasants led by the communists. And as they went head-to-head against the imperialist invading armies, those armies were led by the most skilled military brass, the generals, the strategists who had led their countries through World War I. And the workers and peasants had no military training at that level. They weren't the officers, they weren't the generals. They had just been the foot soldiers, the cannon fodder. And so Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, the leaders of the Russian Revolution, agreed that they had to recruit from the old Tsarist army, the generals and admirals, the military brass, who would help lead the Red Army into battle because they had the training to do so. Now, why would some Tsarist generals support the Russian Revolution? Because of patriotic reasons, because their country was being invaded by outside forces. And so they made an appeal to the bourgeois Tsarist generals to come and lead the Red Army. I mean, can you imagine? So they had a problem, like how would they know as they were led into battle that the generals would actually be loyal to the revolution? So they created a system called the Worker Commissar in the Red Army. And every place where they were succeeding at recruiting Tsarist armies, Tsarist generals to lead the Red Army, they would put next to the general a workers' commissar of equal rank to the Tsarist general. And that worker, basically, I'm simplifying, but in essence what they did was they gave the worker commissar a gun and pointed it at the head of the general who was to lead them. And they said, we need you to lead us. Please lead us well. And if you don't, we will shoot you. Now, that's a very tense relationship between the party and the Tsarist generals who the party had to rely on for that civil war. And ultimately, the Soviet Revolution, again in this backward, underdeveloped country, did the same with industry. They allowed the captains of industry, those who were patriotic, in other words, against the foreign invaders, to be the managers of the current businesses. And in each and every instance, in order to maintain discipline, they created a workers' commissar system that created or maintained the discipline whereby bourgeois privileged elements whose loyalty to the revolution was suspect would be maintained by virtue of threat. That's not a stable political order. Over time, no one wants to work under those circumstances, nor did the communists want to work under those circumstances. And so they replaced the worker commissar who had a gun to the head of the general with another incentive for the general to remain in place and loyal to the revolution. And that incentive was money. That was the beginning of the creation of a privileged layer inside the Soviet Revolution, whereby the revolution, needing the educated elements of the old class to deal with the foreign invaders and the problems of economic development, began essentially incentivizing their relationship by giving them more money. In other words, it was reproducing, even in its first days of the socialist revolution, the inequality that's a hallmark not of socialism, but of capitalism. That's a social problem that Marx and Engels would have never predicted when they made their assessment about socialism, that the socialist government itself would give some people more money than others simply to maintain their loyalty. Why did the Soviets do it? Not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to under the conditions of an emergency situation. They had to survive. And so when we look, and I just give that example of how the corruption, sort of the inherent corruption of a system whereby privilege develops even within the socialist society based on the problem of extreme scarcity and need, unmet need by the revolution. So again, the question is, under those circumstances, was it smart, was it correct for the Bolsheviks to take the power? That's always a question for revolutionaries. Is this the time? Now, they decided the answer to that question was yes. And the answer, the reason they could say yes to that was that their prognosis of how they could survive after getting through the Civil War and the emergency of the moment was that the revolution would become the first in a chain of events leading to other revolutions in the Western world. The Soviet leadership, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, and Bukharin, all of them saw that the success, the stabilization of the Soviet revolution could only happen if there were revolutions in Germany, in Europe, possibly even in the United States, whereby the backward, meaning economically backward Soviet Union could get the aid and the assistance of the more developed economies. Now, that became a huge debate later, and we're going to cover that later, in the debate after Lenin's death between Stalin and Trotsky over what was called the theory of socialism in one country. Stalin argued against Trotsky, and this became a point of intense debate within the Bolshevik Party. Stalin argued, his faction argued, that the Soviet Union was big enough, and if you look at that map, you see that it's the biggest country in the world, that it had vast enough internal resources that if it could possibly hold on to the power for a few years and overcome the counter-revolution, that Russia and the Soviet republics together could manage an internally planned economy that would suffice to carry out the economic development such that eventually the Soviet Union could become just like the capitalist West. In other words, an advanced economy. And Stalin argued that Trotsky's conception that the Soviet Union could only survive based on the internationalization of the revolution was in fact sort of a defeatist view that the Soviet Union was too weak to accomplish those goals. And Stalin argued that Trotsky's defeatism or pessimism about the prospect of the survival of the Soviet Union without the international revolution was in fact a deviation from Marxism and would create a mood, a counter-revolutionary mood inside the Soviet Union. So we're going to come to that, not in this class, that debate, but all of our comrades need to know about the debate, about socialism in one country and the debate between Trotsky and Stalin on that and other questions, because it's important in terms of understanding what the political struggle was all about inside the USSR. And that struggle, by the way, showed itself in all of the countries of the world, in every leftist movement. People took a position. Are you for Stalin or Trotsky? Are you with the Soviet leadership, or are you socialists who have a critique of the Soviet leadership? That debate, even though it seems so remote now, and is remote, has an impact on the evolving worldview of all organizations, including our own. So we want to come back to that so comrades actually get a sense of that, get an understanding of that. But before we do that, I want to turn to another document that we passed out. It's called Quotations from the Third International After Lenin. Do people have that in front of you? Okay. I want to, unfortunately, because we have one mic, I'm going to keep doing the talking and I'm going to read these things. But the San Diego comrades were sent these documents, but just in the last hour or so, so they probably don't have them. But let's read them. This is what Lenin said about that question, December 3rd, 1919. We know that we cannot establish a socialist order at the present time. It will be well if our children and perhaps our grandchildren will be able to establish it. In other words, that was Lenin himself. They created the socialist revolution. Remember, the question is, was it a mistake to have seized the power? Lenin, November 20th, 1915. This shows Lenin's perspective beforehand. A struggle for the socialist revolution in Europe in alliance with the proletariat. Therein lies the objective basis of the absolute possibility of the victory of the democratic revolution in Russia. Matter of fact, remember, he's calling it the democratic revolution rather than the socialist revolution, meaning a revolution at a lower level. That the objective conditions for socialist revolution have fully matured in Western Europe was recognized before the war by all influential socialists of all advanced countries. In other words, not just Trotsky, or not just Lenin, everyone had the same view. Lenin, 1917. A letter to the Swiss workers. Russia is a peasant country, one of the most backward countries of Europe. Socialism cannot be immediately triumphant there, but the peasant character of the country, with huge tracts of land in the hands of the feudal aristocracy and landowners, can, on the basis of the experience of 1905, give a tremendous sweep to the bourgeois democratic revolution, meaning the revolution against landlordism, against the landed aristocracy, against the vestiges of feudalism, not against capitalism itself. The Russian proletariat cannot, by its own forces, victoriously complete the socialist revolution, but it can give the Russian revolution dimensions such as will create the most favorable conditions for it, such as will, in a certain sense, begin it. It can facilitate matters for the entrance into a decisive battle on the part of its main and most reliable ally, the European and American socialist proletariat. That was Lenin's view, looking to the West. Now, if you turn the page over, I want to have a reading from Stalin, because again, remember, we're going to get to the debate about socialism in one country. Could the Soviet Union exist for a long period of time without socialist revolutions in the West? Here's Stalin, who took the different position in 1926. He says, and even as late as 1924, 7 years after the revolution, the overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie and the establishment of a proletarian government in one country does not yet guarantee the complete victory of socialism. The main task of socialism, the organization of socialist production, still remains ahead. Can this task be accomplished? Can the final victory of socialism in one country be attained without the joint efforts of the proletariat of several advanced countries? No, this is impossible. So even as of 1924, this is Stalin's view. To overthrow the bourgeoisie, the efforts of one country are sufficient. Yes, you can overthrow the czar and the capitalists there, but can you build socialism? The history of our revolution bears this out. For the final victory of socialism, for the organization of socialist production, the efforts of one country, particularly such a peasant country as Russia, are insufficient. For this, the efforts of the proletarians of several advanced countries are necessary. Such, on the whole, are the characteristic features of the Leninist theory of proletarian revolution. And then I want to go to the bottom and final quote from Stalin. November 1926, the party always took as its starting point the idea that the victory of socialism in one country means the possibility of building socialism in that country, and that this task can be accomplished with the forces in the single country. So Stalin reverses course. He reversed course. He says, no, we can do this. We can do it by ourselves. What was the basis for the change? Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Bukharin, and all of the socialists of Europe, according to Lenin's earlier writings, assumed that the necessity for socialism to succeed was the victory of revolutions in the West. What happened was that there were revolutions in Germany and in Hungary and in other parts of Europe in 1919 and 1920, and in Poland, which was a big country, a huge country. But all of those revolutions failed by 1926. And there you had the Soviet Union standing alone and the tide of revolution in the West. That moment, those years of revolution receded. And so the Soviet Union, in spite of all of its problems, the prognostication of how it could succeed, those expectations could not be met. And the failure of the world situation to meet them meant that the Soviet Union had to try on its own, more or less, to create the conditions for socialism. Now, did the revolution happen in the West? The Soviet Revolution changed the 20th century. But where were the next revolutions? Just think about this. And maybe I'll just ask the question. Think about where were the other socialist revolutions. Germany failed, Hungary failed, West Europe failed. They happened in China. Where else? Cuba. Vietnam. North Korea. Nicaragua, Cambodia, the poorest countries. In other words, the Soviet Revolution had global influence and promoted revolutions all over the world. But they were revolutions that were even more undeveloped. The countries themselves were even more economically undeveloped. And in each and every instance, the Soviet Revolution extended aid and assistance. Sometimes it was checkered, sometimes it was unstable assistance, sometimes there were betrayals, but more or less, the other revolutions happened with the assistance of the Soviet Union. Just think of the historic implications, comrades, of that. It meant that the Soviet Union had to develop socialism, was looking initially to Western advanced economies for assistance in this arduous path, and instead of receiving it, had to take its own meager development as a socialist country and share with others who were less developed. So the Vietnam War, for instance, and the Vietnam Revolution, did it help the Soviet Union? Well, in one sense, yes, because it weakened imperialism. But that meant the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China had to provide for almost 12 or 15 years huge amounts of their own resources to defend and promote the Vietnamese Revolution against the U.S. invaders. When the Vietnamese shot down the B-52 bombers in 1972, they shot down 25% of all of the U.S. B-52 armada, to the shock of the Pentagon, because the Vietnamese had surface-to-air missiles. Well, they couldn't produce those missiles. Those surface-to-air missiles were produced by the Soviet Union. And that meant that every dollar that the Soviets spent on surface-to-air missiles, either their own or for Vietnam or for other countries, was one or more or less dollar that was available to construct socialism at home. In other words, in each and every instance, the Soviet Union benefited from other socialist revolutions, but not in a real economic and material capacity, but in a political way. They developed alliances. Cuba, it was great for the Soviet Union to have Cuba as an ally in the Caribbean, But what was the immediate effect on the Soviet Union once the Cubans did have a revolution? U.S. imperialism invaded, it blockaded, it set up an effort to smash the Cuban Revolution, and the Soviet Union not only extended aid and assistance, but put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the consequence of that was the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world was almost incinerated in a thermonuclear war. The Soviet Union didn't need that for its economic development. It needed peace. But in each and every instance, the global struggle for socialism, as it went from China in 1949, and North Korea, the Korean War, right after the Chinese Revolution, again, because the revolution was spreading through Asia, that required a huge drain on both the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. In other words, socialism didn't develop under the conditions that make it more likely to succeed. Socialism in the Soviet Union developed in a way that seemed almost impossible for the Soviet Union to succeed. And yet, the Soviet Union was able to retain, the communists were able to retain power until 1991, and between 1917 and 1991, the Soviet Union went from being 1/12 the size of the US economy to being the second largest economy in the world. Again, without help. Again, having to support other lesser developed countries in their socialist revolutions. And during that time frame, comrades, the Soviet Union not only had the problems of isolation, embargo, sanction. There was no country in the world that was more sanctioned, more embargoed, more blockaded than the Soviet Union. No machinery could be purchased from the United States, no technology. Not only did it have those problems and the problems of illiteracy and underdevelopment at home, not even having paved roads or electricity in most of the country. Not only did it have that, but it endured the invasion of Nazi Germany in 1940, and 80% of Hitler's army fought in the Soviet Union. And in order to defeat, and they did defeat, fascism and save the world from Nazism, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people. Young men between the age of 17 and 21 at the time World War II started. Young men between the age of 17 and 21 in 1940. By 1945, only 6% of them were still alive. 94%, an entire generation, was killed in the struggle to defeat Nazism. And in spite of that, and in spite of all of these problems, the Soviet Union emerged as the second largest economy in the world. I mean, when we think about all of that, that helps put into perspective the ruling class argument that socialism inherently is a failed system, as evidenced by the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. I want to review in this final summary, we're going to go back into Soviet history later, but I want to review what are the fundamental differences between the Soviet social and economic order and the capitalist social and economic order. What was the difference? We have to be able to explain that to friends who ask us, well, what is the Soviet Union? What was it? Because most people don't have a clue as to how that system actually functioned, and in what ways was it crucially different from the Western capitalist economic model. There are basically three elements that constitute the core of the socialist economic order. One is the nationalization of the means of production. That means the banks are nationalized. They're not private banks. The corporations nationalized, meaning the state owns all of the essential elements of the economy. So public ownership of the means of production. That's a simple way of putting it. Public ownership rather than private ownership of the means of production. Secondly, the Soviet Union's economy was premised on central economic planning. And thirdly, the economy had what they called the monopoly on foreign trade. These were the three essential distinctive parts to a worker state as opposed to a capitalist state. A capitalist state, the government helps the banks, it facilitates the banks, its main, and the corporations and the private property owners, it helps them, but it doesn't direct them. So the Soviet Union nationalized the means of production and then started producing not for profit, not for the profit of banks or corporations, but because the state and state planning agencies said we need this many of all products. And these products would be produced with this many workers who would come from such and such a location, and the resources, the raw materials, and the machinery would be provided by the state for the production of materials. And then the state would transport the materials. So it's a formidable job. You know, I don't know how many commodities are produced in the United States, maybe 8 million, 10 million, 15 million, it's some large number. And produced with labor inputs from all over the world, because labor, the different components are manufactured all over the world, and that's been true for some time, not just recently, not just in the era of globalization. So organizing an economy with public ownership of the means of production and then central planning means that the planners determine what needs to be produced and how much of it needs to be produced. The advantage of that system is that it eliminates recessions and depressions and unemployment. Every person in the Soviet Union was guaranteed employment. There was no such thing as a labor surplus in the Soviet Union, no unemployment. There was labor scarcity. When you were, like right now, if a capitalist can't sell as many of anything, cars, couches, you name it, if they don't need as many workers, they lay them off. The production is premised, and the hiring of labor is premised on the needs of capital to make a profit. And the capitalist determines whether to employ labor based on their needs to make a profit. If they feel the market has contracted, they lay off. If they feel they can have new machinery replace workers, as we see through automation, they replace workers. Everything that's determined in the production process is determined by the capitalists, and they have the right to do that because it's their factory, it's their corporation, it's their bank, it's their office. Under a planned economy, a workers' state, the working class owns the property through the agency of its state. And so the workers are able to be guaranteed, as they were in the Soviet Union, the right to full employment. During the entire time of the Soviet economic development, with the exception of World War II, with the exception of the Nazi invasion, there was no economic contraction because they eliminated private ownership of the means of production. So if you look at an economic index of Soviet economic growth, it goes like this, just straight up, from 1926 up. It never went down. I mean, there were little waves of not growing as fast, but never a going into negative growth, no recession. There could be bad planning, though, because it's complicated to plan a whole economy through central planning, especially if you don't have computers. Just imagine they had no computers. So everything had to be done by calculations, by estimations, by how much they expected to produce. In other words, you can see how computer society, a computer-driven society, makes planning so fundamentally easy. But in a society without computers and having to do that level of economic planning is just mind-blowing. Every capitalist doesn't have to worry about the rest of society like a central planning board does, because the capitalists just care about their own corporation. They actually don't care about their product. Like, you know, healthcare insurance companies, they don't care whether you actually live or die when you're in the emergency room. They could care less. It has no impact on investors. The investors did not invest in a health insurance company so that you could live when you're having your surgery. They invest in it in order to make a profit, and profit is made by squeezing more productivity out of workers and paying them less than the value that they create, so that the difference, the surplus value that the workers create, accrues to the boss, to the insurance company, to the investor. All of that does not exist and didn't exist in the Soviet Union. So you had a right to a job as a result of a planned economy. The other thing that the Soviet Union did is they said, instead of the capitalists, Forbes just announced 400 richest individuals, their value, their quote worth as people, you know, people in a zoological sense or something, that their worth went up by an average of 13% in the last year. So 400 individuals in America, capitalists, have an average value, these are the 400 richest, $4.2 billion. 4.2 billion. That's 4,000 millions. Now, that's 1/8 of the entire economy. Socialist economy, by expropriating, that is nationalizing the property, takes the wealth and the property away from the capitalists and puts that money into the hands of state planning agencies so that those resources can be used for other purposes. What was the purpose how did they use it in the Soviet Union? One was to further economic investment, electrifying the countryside, building roads, the way any government would do it. But the other thing they did is they said, we're going to make healthcare free. And so nobody had to pay a doctor's bill. When Soviet emigres started coming to the United States in the 1970s, when they found freedom, these were the middle class people who said they would arrive here, and as soon as they got their first doctor bill, they would take it like to the State Department or something and say, well, I got a doctor's bill in the State Department. Whoever was sponsoring them would say, well, no, that's your bill. That belongs to you now. They had no conception that you actually paid money to go to a doctor, because the Soviet economy could take from, by nationalizing the means of production and creating a central economic plan, some of those resources were used for social insurance programs like free health care. Another thing that they could do, they took that money and they used it so that there was free education through all university levels. No student in the Soviet Union paid a penny to go to school. There was no student debt. Another thing they did with the money is, again, the money that would have belonged to the capitalists. If housing was subsidized so that your rent in your apartment, and everyone was legally guaranteed the right to an apartment, your rent could never be more than 6% of your income. Just do that quick math, comrades, in terms of what you pay for rent. Another thing is that they took the money and made sure that child care facilities were built at every workplace. Every mom, every mother, every family had the right to free child care at their place of work. And they were considered to be excellent child care facilities in the Soviet Union. Workers, they took that money from the capitalists, and women workers who were 55 could retire at half pay. Now, half pay is a lot when you consider what Social Security payments are compared to your salary. But just remember, not only did they get 50% at age 55, but they had free health care. I mean, you know, my father's 90 years old now, and he retired from Eastman Kodak after 35 years working as a chemist at Eastman Kodak. 2 days ago, Eastman Kodak announced that they were canceling all the health care plan for all 56,000 retirees in Rochester, New York, which is like a quarter of the city. Just lost their health care because Eastman Kodak just canceled the thing. In the Soviet Union, that was a legal right. No one could ever take away your health care. It was free. So they used that money. And for older people, when they retired, they knew they had that. Men, the retirement age was a little bit older. Another thing they did by taking the money from the capitalists is that the vacation system was such that every worker, when you were, let's say you finished high school or college, you had a guaranteed employment, guaranteed. In your first year, you got 1 month's paid vacation. So all of those things can be done for the benefit of society because the resources no longer belong to the capitalists. Now, going back again to the ruling class argument, they say, well, Soviet Union fell because it was economically less dynamic. It was just run by gray bureaucrats, not by entrepreneurs, driven by profit, driven by the aspiration of enrichment, but nonetheless people who would revolutionize the means of production, create new factories and new machinery so that they can make ever greater profit. But society at the end of the day would benefit from those creations. And so even though it's unjust under capitalism, a disproportionate of the wealth goes to the top, nonetheless, it was so much more dynamic than the Soviet Union. That's not true. If it was true, the Soviet Union would not have become the second largest economy in the world, given this hostile world environment that I discussed in the first half. And not only did it become the second biggest economy, but the working people of the Soviet Union had rights that were far beyond anything that exists in the United States or Western Europe. The unemployed in the United States will get to vote in November, but they don't have the right to their job. Their job and that right to employment is determined exclusively by the capitalist class. In the Soviet Union, the workers actually had the social right to their job, their home, their health care, their education. They owned it. It was theirs. And given all of that, and again, having to help Cuba, help China, help Vietnam, help Korea, help lesser developed economies, and having fought Nazism, the Soviet Union still emerged as the second largest economy. We have to say those facts and know those facts because the characterization of the capitalist class that it's a less, maybe fairer, but a less dynamic economy, that's just hogwash. Yes, there's an element of capitalist dynamism where the capitalists can say, you know what, we're going to close a factory in Lexington, Kentucky, and move it to China because we can make more profits by paying Chinese workers less than we paid the workers in Kentucky. There's a certain dynamism to that for investors, but is there a dynamism for the people who were laid off? Is there a dynamism for all these communities that are withering? Is there a dynamism for working class young people who know now that they will never have decent jobs with decent benefits because the capitalists can make ever greater profits? I mean, what does it mean to be dynamic? Just that we get a new iPhone every year? I mean, when you lose all of that, when you are sacrificing all of that so that the race to produce the latest, newest commodity, maybe a socialist society would say in its early stage, we don't need to have 20 different versions of everything. And that they all have to, and we have to spend, as the United States spends 1/3 of it, the third largest economy being advertising to promote, tell people why we have to have this phone instead of that phone versus that phone. Instead, use that money to actually meet human needs. Like what's more dynamic? And ultimately, not just dynamic for the individual, but dynamic for society. They say, well, the Soviet Union was a repressive state. Well, there's 2.3 million people in American prisons. 7 million people who are either in probation, parole, or in jail. Most of them are in jail because they had drug offenses. I mean, what about them? Is this a dynamic system for people who are considered redundant labor, who are warehoused in prisons, who are super exploited as prison slaves? I mean, yes, dynamic for investors. So we want to, as we look at the Soviet Union, and in the next class we'll examine how the what actually caused the overthrow of the Soviet government. But we don't want to start with this caricatured view, demonized view of the Soviet Union that either one puts the exigency and emergency measures that the Soviet government was forced to put into place as the nature of socialism, because it's not. It's based on the dire needs of starvation or war or invasion or civil war. And secondly, we don't want to pretend that it was just this gray totalitarian nightmare where the people were brainwashed. If you had asked Soviet citizens in 1970, for instance, and people did these surveys, name 5 American authors, they could name them. Ask American working people, name 5 Soviet authors, or even 5 American authors, for that matter. I mean, the level of education was superior for the working class, not for the elites, but for the working class. And that's what matters. I mean, in society, we're producing not for the elites. We want to produce in order to meet human need. So we're going to talk about how the Soviet government was ultimately overthrown, which was not by an anti-communist rising of Soviet workers. That never happened. There was an overthrow of the government, but not because the Soviet workers rejected socialism. But we want to talk about, in the next class, what were the factors and the political struggles internally that did lead to the overthrow of the Soviet Union, which again, the imperialists, the ruling class, the capitalists equate with and conflate with the end of socialism or a doomed dream that turned into a nightmare. What we would say is why it fell, why it grew and why it fell can be based not on an examination of the inherent, quote, deficiencies of socialism, but historically defined circumstances that the revolution faced as it evolved during those 7 or 8 decades. So my part is done, the presentation, and I want to open the floor now for Q&A comments. Okay, let's see if I can do this in 10 minutes and not be superficial.
We have until 6 to get to Easter.
Okay, all right. So let me. I'm going to leave the question of other tendencies till later because that's a big issue. But except maybe I'll take a quick stab at it. We defend the Soviet Union the way we would defend a union. We'd say a union, in spite of whether we agree with the leadership or not, when the bosses attack the union, we know that the boss's only goal is to super exploit the workers. Not because the leaders are good leaders or bad leaders. They just want to get rid of a workers' organization. Soviet Union was a workers' organization, like a union, but one that took the power. It would be like the unions actually having the power. And so we defend the Soviet Union, and you know that slogan in the Harlan County, way down in Harlan County, the miners' struggle, there's no neutrals. You're either on one side or you're on the other side. We're on the side of the worker states, just like we're on the side of the unions. We don't have any, just like when there's a struggle between imperialism and an oppressed nation. We're not like looking at Iran and say, well, we're not part of the Islamic Republic of Iran's politics. We're communists. We're not Islamicists. Thus, we don't care if imperialism smashes them because it's a non-socialist government. That's a struggle between the oppressor imperialist system and the oppressed. We know which side we're on. So that's what makes us distinct. We are on the side of the Soviet Union, but unlike other socialists who are on the side of the Soviet Union, we are independent of the leadership of the Soviet Union. We do not have an identity of views with the Soviet Communist Party, any of them. Well, Lenin. Lenin we consider to be, Lenin's teachings were beyond any other teachings and interpretations. And so there's that. But we're independent. Meaning if the Soviet leadership did something that we thought was wrong, we would criticize it. Same with China. But that doesn't mean we're not for defending the organization of the Soviet Union in the struggle against the oppressors. We are. So that's how we're distinct. Groups like ISO, for instance, International Socialist Organization, they take their differences with the Soviet Union and say, they have basically the same caricatured view of the Soviet Union or Cuba or Vietnam that the imperialists and the capitalists do. And they say, well, because it's not perfect in the Soviet Union, we're actually for the overthrow of the Soviet government or the overthrow of the Cuban government, which they're for. Like, so where does that leave a socialist in the United States when imperialism is targeting Cuba or the Soviet Union? You say, well, they didn't do everything perfectly right, so we're actually either don't care or support the overthrow. When the Soviet Union was finally overthrown, International Socialist Organization supported it. They supported the overthrow of the Soviet Union. They support the Socialist Workers' Party, a Trotskyist group, supported the overthrow of the Soviet Union. The Revolutionary Communist Party said the Soviet Union wasn't socialist at all, so they didn't care that it was overthrown. Progressive Labor Party, another socialist group, also said the same. Like, they were already capitalists, like, who cares? We saw the overthrow of the Soviet government as a historic setback for working people. And not just the people in the Soviet Union, but all the other countries that got aid and assistance from the Soviet Union. That's why the sanctions, that's why the Iraq War happened. That's why Afghanistan is occupied. That's why Libya was overthrown. That's why Syria might be over there. If the Soviet Union existed today, the imperialists would never dare be able to do any of this because the Soviet Union, as a different social order, would have stopped them, and they were strong enough. The destruction of the Soviet Union was a setback for the people of the world. Fidel Castro called it the biggest single setback for working people in the history of humanity. And Fidel was not a follower of anybody in terms of taking his political direction, but he recognized the loss of the Soviet Union, this giant colossus. East Germany was merged with West Germany. East Germany sold the guns to Vietnam so that the Vietnamese could fight back against imperialism. Now, German imperialism is part of the ganging up on Libya and Syria, etc. The legal system. I would rather hold the legal system till the next class, but I do want to say one thing that's very interesting and different about the Soviet Union, which we'll discuss, but which everybody should know. You know how in the United States there's two chambers of Congress, right? We have the president, that's the executive branch, then the legislative branch, two chambers, Senate and the House of Representatives, and a judicial branch, the Supreme Court. Soviet Union had two chambers of Congress too. They called it the Soviets, the Supreme Soviets. One chamber was for all of the republics. They were elected representatives from all the different republics. And then each republic, like I mentioned the republics, the 15 republics, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Latvia, Lithuania, you name it, 15 of them. They each had their own representatives to a second chamber called the Congress of the Nationalities. And so for a law to become a law in the Soviet Union, it had to be ratified by the federal chamber, but also it had to be ratified by the Congress of Nationalities. Just think of how important that was. Like in America, let's say you had a political system where there was a black republic, Mexican American republic, Puerto Rican republic. You know, in other words, had a chamber, and no law could be passed unless each of the nationalities also agreed to it. I mean, that's a high expression of democracy for national minorities and oppressed nationalities. That actually existed in the Soviet Union. That's part of their legal system. The popular conception about Stalin's okay, in terms of Stalin, we think Stalin, internally inside the party, there was repression of different factions during the most tense times of the 1930s and 40s. But what Martial's talking about is when the Soviet Union collectivized and turned private farming into collective farms, there was a civil war between capitalists in the countryside and the forces of socialism, which you would imagine in any sort of gigantic social transformation. And there was a famine, as happens in countries, either because of climate or climate combined with social disruption, like when a civil war happens. So 20 million people are said to have died during the famine in the civil war that took place in the 1930s. We don't know if it's 20 million, but it was a lot of people died. the way Western history reads it is every person who died was murdered by Stalin. So if there's a famine in the country and people starved to death, they were Stalin's victims. I mean, the same thing happened when China was going through the Great Leap Forward. You say Mao Zedong killed 20 million people. Like, really? Why would the Chinese people have his picture up in the Tiananmen Square and consider him the father of the country if he just wiped out 20 million Chinese people? Maybe just because they can't wrap their head around it. I mean, it just, no, there was a revolution and there was a famine and people died of starvation and they weren't all Mao's victim. I mean, it's just, it's part of that, it's a lie. In terms of the revolutions in Germany, Hungary, Poland, and what the United States did about it in the early 20s, the United States couldn't do that much, actually. It wasn't the United States that was the dominant force. World War I ended because of a revolution that took place in Germany. The German soldiers said, we're not going to shoot people, we're not going to shoot the other side anymore, we'd rather shoot our own officers who order us into battle every day. That was a very good move. They had the revolution, the war ended, the revolution broke out in Germany, it broke out in Hungary. In Poland, the communist workers and peasants wanted to unite with the Soviet Union and be part of the Soviet Russian Revolution. Poland had been part of the historic Russian Empire. But the landlords wanted to be independent. It was the landlords and the capitalists who were promoting Polish independence, where the workers said, no, we want to be with the Socialist Revolution in Russia. That failed too. So at the end of the day, it wasn't U.S. imperialism intervening in Europe. It was the revolutionary forces themselves were not strong enough to succeed. That was the reason. In terms of where the Civil War fought, the Civil War between the Russian Revolution happened in 1917. It was basically a peaceful revolution when Bolsheviks came to power. Very few people got killed. Most of the people wanted the revolution to succeed, especially in the cities. They stormed the Winter Palace, they seized the Tsar's family. But then the imperialists from outside promoted civil war, and they united with the reactionary landlord classes and capitalists and some socialists, interestingly. Like, I think we could see how this would play out even now. Groups that called themselves socialists, like the Mensheviks and another group called Social Revolutionaries, ended up fighting alongside the imperialists against the Bolsheviks. The Civil War was terrible. 3 million people died, and it was fought everywhere. In Russia, in Latvia, in Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, the whole region, up until except maybe the southernmost parts of the Asian Republic. Civil War was everywhere. And finally, the Bolsheviks won, but again, it took everything out of the revolution. By the way, this is an important fact about the Civil War. Most of the communists who made the Russian Revolution in 1917 died by the end of the Civil War. Because who was racing to this front, that front, the other front to fight the counter-revolutionaries? It was the most dedicated people. It was the communists. So by the time the Soviet communists consolidated their power, the whole generation that made the revolution was fundamentally gone. That too put a lot of pressure on them to rely on other elements in society to begin the construction of socialism. In terms of communist tendencies in Russia, there are tendencies. There's the Russian Communist Party and other smaller parties. The Russian Communist Party, I don't know what they got in the last election, but it wasn't insignificant. 20%. So 20% is a lot. Like if you have a revolutionary party, 20% is enough to take power, because the revolution's not. We don't make the revolution when we get 51%. It's like, you have enough people, you have enough sympathy, but it's not a revolutionary party. The current Communist Party. It's for the Soviet Union, and it's way better than Putin's party. United Russia, but it's a communist party, but not a revolutionary communist party, I would say. There's more on Russia later. We can talk about that. unions in the Soviet Union. All the workers were in unions. Now, there was a debate, and I think I'll end on this, and it'll be kind of a, have I left off somebody else's question or comment? Okay, if I did, you're probably being too polite to tell me.
Formation of the Third International.
Formation of Third International, okay.
What
And the
is
unions.
international?
Huh?
And what is an international?
Okay, so I'm going to end on this, and I'll try to do this real rapid fire. There was a debate on the unions between Trotsky and Stalin. It's an extremely important debate, and if comrades ever get a chance to read about it, we would like to write about it. We have written about it some, but in 1920, there was an argument where Trotsky argued that the unions in Soviet Russia should not have the right to strike, because who would they be striking against except their own state? So they might have a localized grievance, wages, benefits, something, mismanagement, bad treatment from the supervisor, and some of the workers were starting to strike. And Trotsky said the unions should not be independent, that's their role in a capitalist society, but in a socialist society, if they strike and end production, who does it hurt except the worker state in the socialist economy? So he was against independent unions that could strike against the state. Lenin argued that the unions should be independent and should have the right to strike even against their own worker state. Extremely important debate, because you would hear a capitalist rhetoric, they say, oh, the communists are not for workers having independent unions under a socialist society. Lenin fought for it, and he answered Trotsky this way. This is extremely important, because it even eventually helped develop Trotsky's conception of the socialist transition period. Lenin said, you say, Trotsky, that if the workers strike, they're striking against the worker state. But we are not a worker state. That's imprecise. We are a worker state with bureaucratic deformations, meaning not a pure socialist state, a state that's been deformed. What made it deformed? Scarcity, poverty, invasion, civil wars, but nonetheless it's deformed. And the workers could have legitimate grievances against the socialist state. And from our point of view, as communists, we would prefer to support independent workers' unions strikes against the state that we're managing, rather than sacrifice our credibility with our class, with our base. So we have an inherent tension. We are the managers of a state. We want the state to be better. We want it to run smoothly, but we recognize that we'll have problems and the workers will have legitimate grievances. So in that potential conflict between legitimate union struggles against our state, we support the workers. I mean, that's just a profoundly significant part of Leninist tactics. Like today in China, you see the Chinese Communist Party. China has thousands of protests by workers and peasants all over the place in China. And unlike the United States, most of those demonstrations, which the West, every time like a group of workers in China has a demonstration, it becomes like big news in America. Yeah, but American workers striking is like what, malcontents and teachers who are rich and greedy, or, But if they're Chinese workers, they're valiant, heroic, blah, blah, blah. But because they're fighting against the Chinese state. Now, most of those demonstrations in China, and China's much more deformed than the Soviet Union was because of the market economy there, but most of those strikes and grievances end with the workers winning concessions from the state. Most of them end up with the state saying, okay, we're going to increase your pay by 30%, or we're going to give you the land. Like a large number of those protests. That's way better for a communist leadership to make concessions to the angry workers who are angry either because the communists mismanaged or planned badly, or because there are different injustices that still exist, rather than saying, well, you're striking against our state, so you must be a counter-revolutionary enemy of the people, and we're going to repress you. That doesn't mean there aren't counter-revolutionary enemies of the people who should be repressed, but you know them. Like in Cuba, if the Cuban Communist Party, if the counter-revolutionaries gather in downtown Havana, as they started to do during the special period in 1994, Fidel showed up, but all the workers came out, their unions came out, their neighborhood organizations came out to fight against the counter-revolutionaries in Cuba. You can tell the difference between whether this is a legitimate protest or a counter-revolutionary uprising, manipulated by CIA. But again, that debate, Lenin's position was, as long as there's deformations in the socialist state, the unions and workers should have a right to have an independent expression of their grievances. Third International, what is the International? There's been several. The International is the International Association of Socialist Parties. The first International was started by Karl Marx and other leftists in 1861. And that first International was called the International Association of Working Men, or something like that. Again, 19th century language. It lasted about 10 years. It was dominated by anarchists, not Marxists. The Marxists were a minority, but Marx was the main force behind it. Anarchism in Europe in 19th century was not like anarchism is today in the United States. These were large working class organizations that had an anarchist view. And anarchist and Marxist views had similarities. Both wanted to abolish class society and have equality. There was a difference about whether there would have to be a revolutionary government after the revolution that would be the transition to a classless society. That's the essential difference. The first International, mainly European parties, very few African, Asian, I don't think any, Latin American, Arab. It was a European thing. It was where capitalism started. The Workers' Party started to form first. That International ended really in 1875. Second International started a few years later, and that became a massive international, again, of European parties, because the workers in Germany and France got the right, and UK got the right to vote after they formed workers' parties. And so when the ordinary people got the right to vote, they voted for their parties, their labor parties, their socialist parties. And that's why you see even today, large socialist and labor parties in Europe, unlike the United States. In the United States, people got the right, white men got the right to vote in 1828, 50 years after the revolution. But it was before the formation of labor parties. And so, unlike Europe and unlike the socialist parties, the franchise was associated with supporting lesser evil politics all the time, either Republicans or Democrats, not a labor party. The Second International became a massive party, and it split in 1914, at the beginning of World War I, when most of the socialist parties supported their own governments in World War I, and only a handful of socialists said, no, we said workers of the world unite, we meant it. We're not going to shoot our brothers and sisters. We're not going to be wrapped up into nationalism. We're going to be internationalists. And they were the Bolsheviks and the Serbian Socialist Party and Eugene Debs here in the United States. And they all went to prison. Many of them were executed. But they said no. But when World War I ended in a revolution, when the Russian Revolution and then the German Revolution ended, a new international was formed, which was the socialists who had opposed World War I. And that was called the Third International, also known as the Communist International. And the Communist International was headquartered in Moscow. It was liberated territory. They had the assistance of the state, and they supported the development of communist parties all over the world. And it was the Third International said, they changed the language. Instead of just saying, workers of the world unite, they said, workers and oppressed people of the world unite, became the banner of the Third International. It was an amendment on Marx. And what did that mean? It meant China should be independent. Vietnam should be independent. Korea, all the oppressed nations of Africa and Asia and Latin America and the Middle East. And so all of the revolutionary organization of communists rallied to the cause of the Third International. And it was the first communist or socialist international that became truly global, where the oppressed nationalities were at the very forefront. And that's why, and part of the main reason why you saw the next wave of revolutions be in China, Vietnam, Korea, all over Africa, and of course, very large communist movements in the Middle East. That is the Third International. And it was dissolved 20 years later by Stalin in an effort really to have a peace deal with the West to sort of stop having constant war. But that's another issue. We'll discuss that later.